Yeah, I meant.
Welcome to the first webinar organized by the Calcutta Research Group for the year 2021. Last year, with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic and with the resulting lockdown, we had to very quickly learn how to organize meetings and seminars in a virtual space. And to commemorate the research work that CRG was doing last year, and also to respond to the needs of the times, we hosted the series Borders of an Epidemic. Apart from that, we also hosted a series of public lectures, discussions, roundtables as part of the year-long activity that CRG was involved in. This year, we are starting off with a public lecture. This is the first public lecture for the year 2021. And as you know, the speaker for this is Professor Ranobi Shomadar, and the moderator is Dr. Nasreen Chaudhary from Delhi University, who is also the Vice President of the Calcutta Research Group. So I'll request Nasreen Di to please take over and chair the meeting.
Thank you. Oops. Thank you so much, Shamata. Good evening, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you back to the webinar. Calcutta Research Group has been a pioneer in the process of, kind of turning lockdown or the pandemic into a great opportunity, which enables us to listen to great scholars. I will introduce a person who probably does not require much of an introduction. Professor Shomadar is Distinguished Chair, Migration and Forced Migration Studies, Calcutta Research Group. And today's discussion will be on borders and mobility. And it's a very important aspect of forced migration that Professor Shomadar will be examining and giving his take on a lot of aspects that I'm sure we will be having, much to look forward to. So I would not like to stand between you and Professor Shomadar. So without much ado, Ranbir, over to you on borders and mobility. Thank you.
Thank you, Nasreen, and thanks to CRG for holding this lecture and giving me the opportunity to present before you some of the ideas on which I have been working for the last 2-3 years. The ideas that I am going to present are there in the book, The Post-Colonial Age of Migration. But as you know, the post-colonial age of migration deals with the situations extremely closely and densely. So some of the conceptual points that I thought should be presented, later on I found that they were missing, except in an indirect way in the second chapter. So this is an opportunity, and I thank my colleagues at CRG and those who are listening to this discussion. The title is Borders and Mobility. The first section, the border and its contradictory implications. Border denotes, as the concise Oxford Dictionary says, within quotes, side, edge, boundary, or part of it, unquote, and has distinct sense of, again, within quote, edge or definition around anything, unquote, like we say border district or a borderland. It is an, to continue the COD definition, intermediate condition as between sleeping and walking, unquote. The COD also says that it may indicate, within quote, a debatable ground, unquote. Conventionally, of course, border is a cartographic institution of demarcation, identification, enclosure, delimitation, and protection. And yet, in our awareness, the word marks the presence of an infinite variety of fault lines within a totality. Border, therefore, occasions a shift of analysis from explaining a space with the help of its territorial form to an urge to make sense of the contingent appearance of this territory through associated institutions and forces like a border force, a border gate, an immigration checkpost, etc. Thus we say borders on ground and borders in mind. Border is connected with the concept of boundary through such an epistemological exercise. In the same way, the word is connected with another word in the same family of meanings, namely frontier. The gap and association figure as commonplace in social understanding, and the resemblance of meanings has roots in the breach between a macro-level analysis of a social world and a micro-level understanding of how territory and its associated institutions work together as an assemblage of power. The breach and the connection make it hard to distinguish between symbolic and material aspects of the same social phenomenon, namely border. In short, border as a concept is hard to define and easy to understand through its associated meanings indicated earlier. Border calls for a toolbox of understanding, playing in turn with its own reality, which means the borders of meaning. Thus, though we traditionally think of borders as inscribed onto maps in which discrete territories are separated by lines and colors, this imagination is never clean and without complications. The complexities of the institution called the border stand in contrast with the directness of the force that the image of the border on the map produces on the mind. In view of this, we may say that the history of the institution called border is a condensed form of a history of managing, modulating, calibrating, and regulating the differences of control, composition, territorial identity, etc., as well as passages through these differences. Such passages may be of people, information, money, commodities, and cultural and social artifacts. These passages are the mediations through which the institution of border becomes a reality. A border indicates crossing, passing, to be allowed or disallowed. Border assumes mobility, produces mobility, shapes mobility. We can therefore note the twine reality of the institution of border. It is a mode of declaration of power and its extent or limit, and therefore the attempt to reach a stage of limitlessness, which results in an attempt to continuously stretch the border at times to a supposedly natural marker such as a river, a sea, a mountain, etc. Yet the border is also an invitation to cross, to be mobile, to circumvent, and therefore an eternal burden on power to guard, make it secure, and turn the institution sacred. This double reality, the sacredness of the institution and profanity of our daily acts of negotiating this institution, is a permanent feature of the life of border as an institution. Yet we may say that border and border crossing are not new as inseparable entities.
Shamata, are you there?
Yes, I am here. I suspect something has happened to Ronavita's internet. We will quickly check. He's here.
Yeah, okay.
Ronavita has to unmute himself. Ronavita, please unmute your mic and then you can.
Yes, please continue. Yes.
Okay. While in the beginning we associated citizenship with rights, ownership of a nation, and sovereignty of the people, today citizenship is the mark of identity. Therefore, borders increasingly denote what some thinkers describe as the confines of citizenship. Borders make the construction of identity possible. Though we may have other markers of identity, such as language, ethnicity, religion, clan, caste, occupation, nationality, and even politics, with each of them producing a border, the strongest marker is the identity produced by a territorial border. This is possible because the confines of border create the identity of a citizen, which subordinates all other identities to become the supreme identity. The citizen will have the right to cross the border and leave for another country, will have the right to return, and the immigrant can only enter a country lawfully and stay lawfully because the immigrant is not a citizen. It means that in recovering the histories of nations and citizenship, we have to negotiate borders of various kinds. Borders, boundaries, identity, and transgression, these form the background against which the history of human mobility is written. Conversely, we can say only through the conflictive and contentious history of mobility we can find the history of the institution of border in which are written the other histories of modern nation states and the institution of citizenship. Border, in short, is an apparatus, a mode of material life. Yet remember that the relation between border and mobility produces borderlands. The word indicates semantic affinity with frontier. Borderland does not mean boundary between countries, but points to a frontier region expanding between settlements belonging to two state territories. The term indicates a border zone where different sets of people come into contact, trade, etc. However, it is frequently extended as metaphor to refer to any boundary between the known and the unknown. Borderland is thus imprecise, a gradual shift from one state control to another. This lack of precision is not a conceptual problem, but an actual reflection of the fuzziness of zones around the boundary. Therefore, we may say the term borderland straddles the distinction between frontier and border and is seen as a contact zone of intense interaction of people's ideas and lives. We can see the significance of the term borderland in understanding the relation between borders and mobility. Historians of borders show that histories of borders may be at times histories of in-between existences, lives, and economies, changing with particular circumstances. The people of borderlands are not therefore migrants. They are denizens of a particular space. Histories of Asian countries straddling the Mekong, Brahmaputra, Gangetic, and the Euphrates deltas are replete with such borderlands. One can also note the emergence of such borderlands in sub-Saharan Africa in the century following the Berlin Congress of 1884. Borderland is thus an existence in its own right, defying the neat categorizations attempted by a border. Some say the subjects of borderlands are the nowhere people. Some say they are inhabitants of border zones and border enclaves. Some say they are simply illegal migrants. In this way, border and its associated terms indicate graded territoriality and graded assemblages of power which are built on settlements, mobility, life, economy, and apparatuses of rule. Now, the second section is on mobility and its various registers. I have already said that border presumes mobility and is meant to regulate it. The early 21st century is witnessing a strange phenomenon. The dream of a completely fluid and passable global space provoked by the image of an incessantly globalizing world is not only marked by unequal interconnections and movements which at times appear as obstacles to global unities. Globalization appears to have led to a proliferation of borders, security systems, checkpoints, and physical and virtual frontiers. Borders are all around us. The contradictory reconfiguration of space points to an important aspect of globalization, namely a resurrection of the imperial form which exists with other global forms that depend on interconnections. A telling instance of reconfigured spaces is the phenomenon of data centers, which today house astronomical amount of data and draw their storage and application boundaries on the basis of a template that combines national territorial data protection legislations, technological capacity, farm structure, physical location, and access. An encompassing view of this combination of flows of labor, goods, capital, ideas, and information and connections gives us an unusual view of the reemergence of border as a crucial institution governing human life and economy. Empire makes border the site of demonstration of mobility. In this critical juncture, a timeless human practice transforms into a phenomenon of our time, namely mobility. In this critical juncture, that is migration, a timeless human practice transforms into a phenomenon of our time, namely mobility. Scientifically speaking, mobility is the virtue of existence, an attribute of the living. By being mobile, one will be able to live today. Life is possible with the capacity to be mobile. In that sense, it is a virtue. Mobility is an attribute of which one becomes conscious through the act of migrating. Yet the act of migration also hides the reality of the attribute. Say, for instance, shock mobility or immobility as a dramatic incident caused by an acute disruption producing the act of migrating. The COVID-19 epidemic, as we saw in India, produced massive return migrations, which we are still searching for the right word to understand and explain. Mobility is thus a black box, the secret holding of the mysteries of pattern, duration, density, demographic composition, and temporal dynamics of migrants and migration. Mobility invites states to innovate and deploy instruments to make it secure and safe. Mobility is an attribute of certain events like political demonstrations, pilgrimage, festivals, exhibitions. But equally importantly, or perhaps more, it tells us of human livelihood. Think of labor in gig economy, drivers, delivery workers, street vendors, maintenance technicians of long distance operation systems, street children. Mobility is their main mode of labor and life. Not only that, they facilitate the lives of others who do not engage in moving jobs. Mobile livelihoods today are increasingly mediated through large digital platforms. By the same token, mobility is turned into a commodity through mobile business operations. In this case, as one may say, mobility is outsourced. Neoliberal age redistributes mobility across different populations. Yet, the imperial form of power does not enable mobility to appear as a pure phenomenon. Through border and the act of migrating across borders, the imperial form of in turn turns citizenship into an institution with its confines and borders. The history of mobility was enveloped in the realities of borders and migrations. We may recall the classic concept of borders had emerged in the wake of the emergence of the modern state and its geopolitical dimensions, within which the individual is historically constructed as a citizen. Nation, state, citizen, border, all these seem to unite in a perfect fit. Transborder migratory movements threw this symmetry in disarray. Earlier, sovereignty was not strictly territorial. Gradually, walls became the form of bordering, enclosing and preventing. Cities, towns, countries, vast regions, landscapes all began to be fortified through the Middle Ages. Checkposts and toll centers along walls or along rivers as borders became gates for merchants, pilgrims, and all kinds of shelter seekers to enter and leave the towns and kingdoms. The wall illustrates how this ancient mode of fortifying a town became in course of time a crucial logistical aspect of governance. The wall still remains one of the most effective ways of governing space. For instance, in what was called as the year of the European migration crisis 2015, experts pointed out how states had begun building fences in frenzy. The Economist predicted Europe would soon have more physical barriers on its national borders than it did during the Cold War. It pointed out that in September 2015, Hungary completed a fence along its border with Serbia, a major point of entry for refugees making their way into the European Union. Spain fenced off its Moroccan enclaves of Ceuta and Melilla. Earlier, Greece had put fences. Romania built defenses. The same report pointed out that since the fall of the Berlin Wall, 40 countries around the world built fences against 64 of their neighbors. By the end of 2016, with the completion of the border with Jordan, Israel surrounded itself entirely. In 2013, Brazil announced a virtual wall monitored by drones and satellites around its entire, nearly 15,000-kilometer long border. The wall thus still works as a model. In an airport, there may be invisible wall to control and regulate immigration. At times, the situation calls for a double periphery. A relevant instance of this is the formation in the colonial time in the Indian northeast of inner lines and excluded and partially excluded areas. As in Old Delhi, the outer wall figured the periphery of the town, the inner wall of the fort figuring the seat of royal or imperial power. Wall separates, defends, prevents. Wall also connects the towers from where you can see and watch. More importantly, walling by a modern democracy indicates a more general turn towards logistical administration of territory. At once an apparatus of border control, also the result of the drawing of a stunningly rigid line, the border in form of a wall may soon become a frontier, which will be a busy, noisy, multicultural zone occupied by officials, revenue personnel, soldiers, and civilians from all over the country. The border, ironically, that was to replace the frontier with the erection of the wall again becomes the frontier. But this should not be surprising. The modern border, even with its most flexible management, shows the reflection of the long shadow of the military model on politics. As we know, politics as a technique of internal peace and order had always sought to implement the mechanism of the perfect army, of the disciplined mass, of the docile and useful troop, of the regiment in the camp and the field, of maneuvers and exercises. From Michel Foucault, we can draw the valuable insight, namely, that if there is a politics war series that passes through strategy, there is an army politics series that passes through tactics. The tactic of bordering and boundary making aims, among others, to control and regulate mobility, the ultimate goal being maintaining civil peace through social order and security. The paradox is, how will the government combine considerations of select citizenship and security with communication and circulation of labor, commodity, money, and information? The new science of urban planning aims at utmost freedom of circulation and therefore seeks to free the city of internal borders and boundaries. Yet, these mean, and again recall the experiences of the pandemic, the emergence of risks, and thus of a risk society, the other name of free society. Neoliberal governance tries to combine risk and freedom, a combination that goes by the name of security. Laws are thus constituted and judged accordingly. The entire society is planned as urban society, with the regions beyond the great metropolitan centers transforming as suburbs requiring high-speed trains, greater aerial transportation, digitized high-speed communication, and greater vigil by the police. Yet, it is precisely in the so-called period of opening up, let us say in the last 20 years, that control regimes of movement have been instituted. Immigrants in cities are now documented more than ever. Aliens are now routinely rounded up. Xenophobic language has developed in the form of neo-racism and now characterizes democratic politics. The visa regimes are now more stringent. Even the phrase Fortress Europe tells us of its military origin in the Second World War. And now the phrase tells us of European Union's hard policies to prevent illegal immigration and control mobility within the continent. Originating perhaps then from the military origins, border as an administrative measure points to the general issue of governance of mobility. The civil military origin of such governing mode is reflected even in the mandate of the European border agency, the Frontex. Frontex says that its mandate is to promote, coordinate, and develop European border management in line with the EU Fundamental Rights Charter, applying the concept of integrated border management. This only shows how the strategy of combining control and freedom has become desperate with time. The contradiction between security and openness, or between regulation and mobility, persists in the mobile spaces such as the sea or the air. We are accustomed to thinking of these spaces as openness, that is, without borders, thus the open sea and the open sky. Yet, the ways in which the sky and the waters of high seas are marked with borders and regulatory zones are evident today. Think of the phenomenon of mare clausum. Mare clausum denotes closed sea. In international law, it means a sea, ocean, or any other navigable body of water being under the jurisdiction of a state and close to other states. It is the opposite of mare liberum, the free sea. Portugal and Spain in the early colonial age practiced a mare clausum policy, which was challenged by the other European powers soon. Now, in a reshuffled strategy to contain seaborne migration and restrict mobility on the Mediterranean, the EU, around the middle of the second decade of this century, decided on a strategy to contain and seal the sea. Two researchers in a report, Forensic Oceanography, Mare Clausum, demonstrated how in its policy of stemming migrant crossings of the Mediterranean into Europe, the EU, with Italy as the frontline state, enacted an undeclared operation termed as Mare Clausum, which drew on the history of the colonial practices of frontier management. The colonial imprint on the refugee and migrant control policy is clear. Recall the doomed voyage in 1914 of the Komagata Maru. Indeed, it is tempting to read the history of the voyages in the Indian and Pacific Oceans in the light of the contemporary movements across the Mediterranean. The history that began with Komagata Maru continues till this day with perilous journeys by, for instance, Rohingyas to various countries and islands and the Australian waters. The trend of closing open seas directs our attention to the way management of borders has evolved. As I indicated, European border management has taken on the shape of frontier management, which is why it has become flexible. Biometric and other technological developments have enabled this flexibility inasmuch these developments have forced the migrants to be more resourceful. Combined with the technological mode, the humanitarian nature of the work has made an efficient security policy possible. Today's border management strategy has taken leaf out of the colonial security policy that heavily depended on frontier management. Frontier was a regulatory principle of high order for colonial rule. For population to be managed and population groups to be stabilized and governed, colonial rule needed flexible border policy. Such policy allowed expansion. It included administrative policies for footloose population groups and, more importantly, measures that enable shifting of a border in case of need. In other words, establish a border that would not be restricted to a line. European powers determined their own urban policies of population management, drawing internal boundaries within a city, particularly the Mediterranean cities of France and most of all, Paris. These policies are now being brought back to operation. The rival demands of security and flexibility produce the political contradictions within the task of governing mobility. It is in this context that the figure of the migrant acquires the status of the abnormal. Since the contradiction or paradox, if you like, does not go away, hence in real world, we find a number of associated concepts such as frontier, borderland, boundary, etc., because bodies forever try to displace borders. Bodies and borders characterize the interdependent but opposite poles of global mobilities of our time. These mobilities signify the particular dynamics in the relation between labor and power in a global frame. Mobility is increasingly characterized by interruptions, discontinuities, hiding, disappearance, turning back, long stopovers, layovers, frequent shuffles, shuttling back and forth, and the sudden emergence of a labor market, which can be termed only in terms of the discrete nature of labor. You may term it as division of labor, marked by the borders of the states and boundaries of metropolis periphery relations. In view of the uncontrollable nature of mobility today, there is thus a growing literature on what we call autonomy of migration. At the same time, researchers on the nature of borders, boundary setting exercises, routes and roads, and moving and modes of moving vehicles, etc., they have shown how all these are increasingly shaping human mobility. What does then assertion of autonomy by the migrants in face of the biometric, aerial, and various virtual modes of border control mean? Particularly when these biometrics turn migrants' bodies into a means of mobility control? In this milieu, how do migrants appropriate the capacity to be mobile? And now the last section, which is borders, mobility, and our histories. Till now, we have referred intermittently to the conflicting relationship between borders and mobility that symbolizes the problematic of combining security and freedom in democracy. The problem of combining security, that is border regulations, immigration control, surveillance, confinement, etc., and freedom of work, circulation, and movement was temporarily solved with the emergence of modern political society where citizenship, territoriality, borders, and sovereignty were combined on the template of the modern nation state. This combination gave birth to what we know today as popular democracy. Yet we cannot forget that popular democracy also produced, or at least coexisted for a long time with colonialism, which reinforced the role of borders crucial to sovereignty. Colonialism meant fundamentally four things in this respect. A, clear territorial distinction between the sovereign state and the subjugated areas known as colonies. B, clear legal distinction between participants of the polity, that is citizens, and the colonial subjects. C, clearly demarcated sites of developed sectors of economy and the production of primary goods. And D, finally, an effective way of combining territorial conquest, subsequent annexation, and the long-distance control of economies of the world, as if politics had solved the question of the distinction between internal and external, which was supposedly the only thing required to guarantee order and peace. It is important to understand that in the past, the geopolitical, moral, and the juridical architecture surrounding the concept of empire had the essential task of doing away with the issue of border. Everyone was within it, yet many outside it. Imperial confines were in the nature of lines of a concentric circle, taking care of the inner lines, while borders retained for the empire the function of drawing the ultimate line from beyond which tributes did not flow in. In this way, sovereignty was sought to be delinked from its territorial form. Yet, the history of the colonial empire of the second half of the 19th century to the first half of the 20th century was also a period of the history of post-colonial nation form that inherited the legacy of border as an institution. It was also a turbulent history of migrations and migratory systems that had no ordered geography. In this context, we may recall that even in the 19th century, Europe, states had less control over their borders. It was an anomalous age which contained the unreported histories of masses of errant, deported, and eradicated individuals who lived in a foreign land in countries that did not recognize their belonging. As Saskia Sassen said later, the expulsions continued. But why only Europe? Everywhere these migratory movements have fractured the national, regional, ethnic, and linguistic features of polities and political societies. Globalization has given birth to the concept of meta-borders, indicating the epistemic division between the notion of frontiers of an expansive land and the boundaries between its constituent units, territorial and non-territorial. Yet, as a strategy, it has had mixed fortunes. While in the last 15 years, this institutionalization of meta borders as a strategy has served the function of locating and defining the metropolitan land better, it has ill served the function of stopping the raids from what the metropolitan land considers the extraplanetary animals. Thus, for instance, labor flows from what is called New Europe to Old Europe, or from Mexico or Puerto Rico to the United States, put pressure on the internal confines of an empire. The border slash confine in this way is continually under pressure, and the stress reproduces itself in the interior of the core. The concentric circles are produced in this way. We may say that neoliberal politics manages mobility in this way. It is stressful, but there is no other way a neoliberal politic can combine borders and mobility. Finally, then, the historic question of mobility is now louder in the wake of massive displacements and their mixed nature. More and more people are in a state of uprootedness and traveling in order to leave. Conflict causes displacement, development causes displacement, environmental management or mismanagement causes displacement, famine and disease cause displacement. These result in mixed situations of migration which defy neat classificatory governmental strategies, of which implementing a specific border regime, border force boundaries, immigration control systems, or biometric techniques, anticipatory strategies to regulate population flows, etc., is one. Mobility in such milieu has become a part of the biopolitics of our time, while border management contributes to the biopower of the neoliberal world. As the world economy becomes densely interconnected, finding out the right way to manage the borders in a flexi-rigid mode becomes a perennial exercise. Governing strategies have to ensure that labor flows must not be directionless. They must conform to the ways the global regime of division of labor has laid down. This is the governmental rationality under global conditions referred to earlier. The army of labor, along with the reserve army of labor, must conform to the institutional rules of global labor market. All these explain the shock and unpreparedness of national governments and international agencies confronted with ever new waves of population entries, braving the seas, lands, skies into the northern hemisphere and other regions. These massive flows are rocking social sciences, which were all built on a certain idea of a stable social space and which have no clue as to how to comprehend this figure of the migrant knocking and now banging the heavy doors of settled states. The figure of the migrant in this context is now considered as one of the abnormal. One of the tasks of the historians working on migrants, therefore, is to trace as to how this abnormal figure of the mobile subject has emerged, a figure that upsets all rational ways of ordering life and economy. One such recent attempt is by Thomas Nail, who shows how the succeeding categories of the nomad, barbarian, vagabond, and the proletariat emerged in history, all symbolizing the figure of the mobile subject. In short, the phenomenon of autonomy of migration speaks of the biggest problem in the border management of our time, namely that the unruly phenomenon of mobility interferes and disturbs the ordered circulation of labor. I shall now skip two paragraphs because the songs outside tells me that the time is over. Let me read out the last paragraphs then. The migrant produced by the border now threatens the institution of border. Just 1 minute.
While Professor Shobhata takes the opportunity to shut his window, we welcome you to West Bengal on the eve of during the elections, and we also encourage you to please leave your question in the Q&A box or in the chat box. Thank you.
The migrant produced by the border now threatens the institution of border and along with it, the boundary making exercise, one of the eminent control modes of modern democracy. We may add, there is an accompanying shift in the gravity of democracy. The fundamental problem of public power will no longer be the condition of popular sovereignty or the condition under which people's rights can be secured. The problem will be how to set the juridical limits to the constitution of the people. Paradoxically, with this, we enter the age of an economic historicity that will govern the constitution of the people. Recall the classical mercantilist age when borders balanced the economic gains while the constitution of people went on as a parallel process. Now, border as an institution is clueless in the face of the conflicting forces of trade, identities, logistical compulsions, and flows of labor and capital. Governmental reason oscillates between economic rationality and the attempt to secure perpetual peace through compacts among stable identities. Researchers have discussed how border facilitates the process of multiplication of labor. At the same time, the reserve army of labor building up on a global scale must be retained in harness in a national form. Borders thus shape labor markets. What then in this situation will be the principle of calculation for the cost of economic freedom? More fundamentally, what then will happen to the mobile bodies? Whatever may be the answer, but perhaps we can venture that from now on we shall be, to use a philosopher's phrase, compelled to live dangerously. To continue, think dangerously, because borders not only produce mobility, they make our knowledge permanently inadequate. They invite us to think of other possible worlds. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ronvita, for that very insightful, opening of a session on border and mobility. And I'm sure the audience of this evening will agree with me that none other than you would have been very, would be able to, shed so much of, insight into the whole discussion. I think it's a very timely discussion to have on just not on border, but also the mobility in the context of the pandemic. And I personally appreciate the theoretical insight a lot. But let me just open up the floor for questions. And one was sent to me by Shramuta. So should I begin with that? Ranavita, is that okay?
Can you give me a minute so that I close the other window and door?
Sure, absolutely, absolutely, absolutely.
The election campaign is winning.
Nasreen, the question is from Professor Shobhoshachi Bosurai Chaudhuri. I am just the messenger.
Oh, I see. Okay. I misread it. So do we have a few more questions coming up? There's only one. I can see one more.
Yeah, Nasreen, sorry.
Thank you so much. Ronavita, I actually misread. This is a question from Shobhushajida actually. And I'm just going to read it out so that I don't miss out the points. He's saying, taking cue from your comment on graded territoriality and in view of treatments meted out even to the citizens of a country being COVID-19 pandemic, would it be appropriate to argue in today's new liberal economy, we are witnessing hierarchies of belonging being generated through the intersection of race, ethnicity, and territoriality, thereby simultaneously reshaping citizenship? If so, is it being unfolded on the basis of neoliberal morality? So this is a question from Shobhushajita. And then I'll take a few more, but I think, Ronavita, you can begin your deliberation a little more on this, and I'm sure we will benefit hugely. So over to you, Ronavita.
I mean, by and large, Shubhoshachi's point is right. But you see, the hallmark of, as I said, the hallmark of neoliberalism would be instituting a flexi-rigid mode in managing society. So, if you ask what is the difference between race management in a liberal society and a neoliberal society, the neoliberal society is marked by continuous attempts to open up the market and make market accessible for everybody. So blacks should be market players, white should be market players, the YOLO races should be market players, the disabled would be a market-enabled individual. And in order to therefore open up the market and make the society a market-enabled institution, a market-enabled reality, the neoliberal form would therefore continuously adjust those social fault lines to the to what it considers to be the ultimate reality, that is the reality of the market. So you will find, in fact, that even in the churning of the castes in India, whether you notice it in the wake of the elections and everywhere, that each caste will therefore produce a kind of a rich stratum which would have then link with every other commercial sections of society. So, as I said, that there is an economic theology which is operating, which is not only as powerful as other moralities are, but I think the neoliberal argument would be that your freedom is best guaranteed only when you are able to access the market. Your children will not be disadvantaged that they can access schools, that they will get educational loans, that they will be able to go to higher educational institutions, etc., etc. That everybody can produce merit. Everybody can be theoretically a subject of. So neoliberalism, in a way, therefore, takes the fundamental points of the 21st century critics of liberalism, whether you speak of Naomi Klein, or I can go on with name, or, you know, Philip Mirowski says actually that neoliberalism has learned from the critiques of liberalism much more than what the left learned from that.
Okay. I'll come back to that point when I have an opportunity, but I will leave it at that. I will read out one of the questions that came out from by Anamika. Anamika, I want to know, do border dispute produce differential identity or complicated identity? So it's a question of differential identity. Whether border dispute produces differential identity, or does it further complicate the question of identity?
I mean, I have no, you know, standard answer for this. It can differ from, you know, case to case. Let's say the French and the Germans fought for such a long time over Alsace-Lorraine. But, and then after the Second World War, who could imagine that France and Germany could, you know, settle the problem, etc., etc. You have the First World War ending with several treaties on borders, so both on the east and the west. But then again, conflicts flared up. So I think it differs from case to case. I mean, they might complicate, but disputes might come. But border disputes need not necessarily flare up into something which is unmanageable. But then, since, as I said, that borders are in a way the greatest builders of identity,
right?
So they may.
Before I come to my question, I'll take another more. This is a question from Shamna. Global North showcase a scenario of border control.
Sure, I think it's a good point, and as I said towards the end, that biometric mode would actually make the body itself the border.
Right.
So this will be, in a way, you can say, the, you know, think of the film Minority Report. So it's the ultimate dream of managing the society where borders are everywhere, yet borders can be managed.
Right.
So the body may be mobile, but, you know, you have come to manage mobility.
That's a very good point for me to enter with my question. It's not a question, Arupita. I'm always curious to know, when we discuss issues of mobility, we are also bringing in the aspect of immobility. So in that discussion, do we always see it in the context of a binary? Because in a way, I think the entire your presentation, which was kind of gives us a sense that, you know, border constitutes mobility. So thereby, counterintuitively, what is it that we are missing out when we talk about the immobility aspect also?
No, I say that it is only when there is some kind of a catastrophe, only some kind of a disaster, that therefore I use the word like the shock doctrine, the shock capitalism. So you have now the whole idea of the shock mobility and the shock immobility. So there is an earthquake. You want to run away, but you cannot. You are trapped. So the idea of being trapped in a situation is telling in another way that we have to get out of this, that this is a closed situation. So, and it comes as unanticipated. Therefore, in fact, people say that some of the greatest migration movements have been produced by this whole idea of the shock, the disaster, the sudden appearance of certain things, which then impel people to move. And otherwise, mobility is certain thing of which we are not aware of. So that's why I say that mobility is a virtue. It's an attribute of a virtue of a certain situation. Migration speaks of more of a practice, certain acts. But you become aware of mobility, which is in a way the timeless quality, one of the qualities of human life, only through borders and migratory practices.
Thank you. Okay, so we're getting a few more questions. During pandemic, we realized the borders of Indian state got activated during lockdown phase. How do we see these borders in normal and exceptional time?
Also, there is Paula's question, has the pandemic created a paradigm shift in our perception of borders?
Oh, yes, of course. Yeah, I missed out that one. Okay, yeah. And then Paula's question. So do you want to take this one? And then Paula's question, I'll take it up in a bit, because that would require more deliberation on your side.
I think it only, Manish's question, it's to all panelists, but you asked me to answer, but I think others could have. But in any case, it's an important point, and it validates what I say, that the border between, let us say, UP and Bihar, it becomes important, let us say, when you speak of migration, or you speak of a border town, etc. Now it got activated, as Manish says, in the wake of the lockdown, precisely because of certain things, certain events, those cataclysmic things, which then you saw the mobility, human mobility, you visualized it, you witnessed it, you experienced it. And then what is rather more interesting is that Indian federal system, which has the basis of borders between different states, even though the Indian Union can abolish the border, merge the state, it doesn't take much kind of constitutional revision to do that. You saw it in the case of the bifurcation of Telangana and Andhra Pradesh. Bifurcation of Andhra Pradesh into two parts. But in this case, as you saw, UP said, these are our migrants, we shall take care of them. West Bengal had to say, these are our migrants, we had to take care of them. But till the other day, they were not saying. They were quite happy that the migrants were away and they were sending money back. And so the villages of Malda or Murshidabad were on the whole fed and kept. Similar is the case with many towns of UP or Chhattisgarh or Jharkhand. But only when they were returning, when they could not cross the, the borders of different states. They were kept at bay. They were confined, etc., etc. And people started saying, what about the responsibility of the government? That the state government started owning up. And this is unprecedented in the political history of Indian federalism, when it's like Chinese labor, if discriminated in, let's say, Malaysia or in Singapore or in Southeast Asia, China would say that you are discriminating against our people. Now, so long Bihar was saying that Biharis are being discriminated in Mumbai or in Maharashtra. Bengalis were saying little bit, not so much. But after this, with this, cathartic experience, that states started saying, yes, we have a responsibility towards our own migrants. And this would not have been possible if there were no borders. Border, therefore, as I said, it is an apparatus of producing subjectivity.
I think Paula's question is very critical when she's suggesting has there been a paradigm shift in the perception of borders? So you might want to kind of address that also. Yeah.
Paradigm shift in this, to some extent, I was not thinking of a paradigm shift, because first of all, you can say that this disease in the post-independence time in India, but this has happened earlier. Therefore, I'm not using the word paradigm shift, where we realize borders can't stop the disease. Yet, we have to continuously institute borders to check the disease. And this is the paradox that I'm mentioning again and again. We know that, okay, if it was the Wuhan virus, as President Trump was telling, or the Chinese virus, so the Chinese virus cannot be stopped from entering United States. So we must investigate, like the zero patient, the zero country. Nobody is saying that if this is the case, today probably it originated from China, tomorrow it might originate from Thailand, the other day it can originate from, let us say, Brazil or any country. So beyond a point, searching for the origin is meaningless, because the reality is that borders are made infructuous, borders are made ineffective by the disease, by the specific disease. At the same time, governments all over the world are compelled to use bordering strategies in order to contain the virus, in order to do preparation. We all know all that. So I think if you say it's a paradigm shift, as I said, maybe I will not use that, but I can certainly say that this whole question of the flexi-rigid way of managing the borders will be inscribed deeply now into popular consciousness. It was so long a mark of the neoliberal management, and I said that it drew from the imperial management, which had borders, but only as the last thing. But basically, it was a question of graded territoriality. But now, nation states will also inherit that imperial form, and where we shall see particularly, and that is where I think the pandemic becomes a kind of a quickening factor, an accelerating factor that will now tell us that border here today, border there tomorrow.
Okay. Okay, I'm just a bit slow with my reading of questions, and they seem to be disappearing. Just give me 1 second. Okay, there's a question from Kasturi Datta. Can you elaborate on how state governments have responded to this various, strategies of, allowing migrants to go back, and in relation to, let's say, the employment opportunity and so on and so forth. So I guess her question is the impact of the lockdown on the migration itself. Do you want to club 2-3 questions together, Anubhita? Or
Sure. Why not?
This one is from Okay, perhaps you should take this one because this one is on Rohingya. So this is slightly different.
So I should respond to this.
Yes, please.
You
Yes.
see, I mean, states doing something for migrants. This is not exactly, I mean, relevant to what I was discussing. I mean, we know we have written so much on that, on the pandemic and all that. So I don't want to repeat. But I think something that it occasions my comment that we all knew that India is divided into the receiving and the sending zones. So east, northeast, they send labor, and the west, the south, they receive labor. And even in election campaigns and everywhere, we can see that West Bengal, or for that matter, other states are castigated. You can't take care of your people. They have to go out in search for food or income. Now, that can be said of the global south then, because they send people to the north. But it can be, spoken of all countries. If you see, there is a very fascinating book. It is called Bards of Passage. And it is a story of population flows from the south of the United States to the north, to the industrial towns that were being built. And it showed how the growth of the industrial towns in late 19th, early 20th centuries, it actually Pittsburgh, it discusses a lot, but several other cities, where it produced those para-industrial enterprises and concerns, which then attracted migrant labor from the south, including eating houses, etc. So one thing that you may say is that there will always be, as I said, given this, that there will be mobility, and states, I mean, we have therefore two. One is that states will have to come to terms with the fact that there will be mobilities. In as much as West Bengal cannot leave without sending its labor, Kerala cannot leave without receiving the labor, or Maharashtra cannot leave without receiving the labor and employing them. So by the token with which you can say West Bengal government has been callous or has been negligent in protecting its own people, by the same token you can say that people of Maharashtra are lazy, therefore, they can't work by themselves and they depend on others. But this takes us nowhere. The fact is that labor circulation, the fact is that circulation of commodity and labor power is one such, is now a secular fact of the Indian economic life, and states, to the extent that they represent the people, would have to have responsibility in terms of securing the work of, or making the work of mobile labor safe. But mobility would be a part of the federal reality, and to that extent, Indian federalism has almost no answer, constitutional or of the way in which economic relations between the states will be managed. In the Indian constitution thought so much about water sharing, as you know, but what about labor? And in that sense, the 1980 Act is very inadequate, the Interstate Migrant Workmen's Act.
So let me just move on to the Q&A section where there are 3 questions. And I think you kind of addressed some of it, but perhaps you might want to go a little more in detail. How states' control of territorial border affects mobility of women and men and people who identify as trans because of obvious demarcation of their bodies. That's one. And the second is by Amrita on the notion of border constituting mobility and mobility as virtue. If we understand post-colonial mobility as a right and claim to space, then do borders produce resistance within itself in this play of borders? So perhaps you can club these 2 questions together, Amrita.
Yes. I think the state's control of territorial border affects the mobility of women, but affects means, does it adversely affect? I do not know, because there is little data to show that women are less in number among the migrants and refugees. In fact, you may say that women are more in number. So if it affects, I mean, children, men and women of different colors, races, situations, countries, they are all affected. They are all predicated on the way in which border is done. And you may say that if you think of the sea, as I said, the Mediterranean crossing or other crossings, then again, women, men, all of them are there. I cannot say of people who identify as trans. I do not have knowledge of that. But bodies are demarcated in different ways. This much I can say. And bodies are demarcated in different ways by border control institutions, border control modes. That's for sure. And the second point, which is that post-colonial mobility as a right and a claim to space. I mean, I didn't say mobility as a right. I said mobility is a virtue. Virtue meaning not in the sense of good or bad, not vice or virtue, but simply virtue means an attribute, the quality of a certain thing. And it's a material form of human life. So and this is why I said that you will have always certain areas, certain spaces which will receive, and certain spaces which will produce the goers, the givers, etc. And this is true not only of human mobility, this is true of mobility of knowledge, this is true of other phenomena. So, but borders do produce resistance, but again, resistance or border produce resistance, but resistance also then makes border management, more knowledgeable. So it's a game, khela hobe kind of game between the two. And the challenge of border management is how do you learn from the resistance and inscribe into your management technique the resistance that happens. So that is what I'm emphasizing again and again. The neoliberal rule and the neoliberal administration of border is not a naive administration. It's not ignorant. It is not unmindful of the fact that migrants want to act autonomously. And you try to stop migrants, the migrant finds other ways. But that the migrant will find other ways is already built in the calculation of your border techniques.
There are two questions on borderland, Ranabida, from the Q&A section. Then I'll come back to the chat section questions. Malini has written, you spoke about borderlands as meeting points of culture, politics, and passage of goods. But pandemic also forces us to rethink these connections in terms of new forms of insularity and alienation. So she wants your thoughts, and perhaps you can combine this with the second one. In the course of pandemic, everything becoming virtual. Is there a blurring of borderline? So I guess they are kind of, speaking to each other in a very different way. If yes, what is your take on states' invasion of literal as well as metaphoric borders of individual? So, yeah. We have quite a few questions, Ranabida. So, yeah.
So these are difficult questions for me. Now, in the course of pandemic, is everything becoming virtual? I don't know. I mean, as I said, that mobile economic subjects like the delivery workers employed in gig economy, they help you to remain virtual. But they are the other side of virtual existences. So everything is becoming virtual. I'm not very sure of that. And therefore, there is a blurring of borderline. Think of vaccine. And people are now saying of vaccine nationalism. Yesterday, there was news all across that Germany and France supposedly, arch enemies of Russia have open discussion with Russia on to ensure supply of the of the vaccine, the Sputnik. So blurring of borderlines, I only go back to what I say, which is that neoliberalism depends on a flexi-rigid mode of border management. So the state's approach to human bodies is also patterned on that logic.
Okay. I
And
think, sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
and the question of insularity and alienation, which Malini, it's an important point. But again, the new forms of insularity and alienation is creating again new forms of contacts. Again, think of the waste disposal workers or the delivery employees, whether in the post-colonial setting or other kind of thing. You have the coexistence of new contact zones, new modes of contact, and newer myths of insularity. I think the pandemic, in fact, re-emphasizes all that are characteristics of a neoliberal world. And therefore, you may say, in fact, Samir Amin prophesied that this is a neoliberal pandemic is coming. He didn't know of course, the COVID-19, but he was speaking of the neoliberal pandemic.
There were two questions on back. I'm trying to bear with me. I'm trying to club the questions.
Yes,
so
yes.
to the audience also, I just
Whenever it is over, I will be happy to.
No, it's not over yet, Anubhita. So we're not letting you go as yet. So there are two questions on vaccine by Paula and Ankur Sharma. So Ankur's question is, what is your view on vaccine passport? I think this is what you were trying to get at, as becoming a necessity for cross-border human mobility. And Paula's question is, are vaccines an instrument of border control, like new instrument? And it becomes, where bodies become a tangible asset at that level.
What are vaccines? What's the
Are vaccines the instrument of border control? So is it a kind of a new instrument where, it's being exerted on the bodies to control and to manage?
You see, I do not know. I mean, I'm not, you may, on the other hand, argue that vaccine and you're carrying your vaccination certificate is supposed to declare that you are a safe individual on the whole and you are not spreading the infection. So that dangerous word contagion is met by this whole thing of your vaccine identity. So whether they control it, they will be, but then if you think of old passports, if you had been to any of the Middle Eastern countries, you would not be allowed to go to you would not be allowed to go to Israel. But on the other hand, if you have visited Israel, till the other day, you could not have visited Egypt or Jordan. So passports in any case, Pakistan, again, certain countries are declared as, they are harboring terrorists. And if your passport shows that you had visited those countries immediately at the immigration checkpoints, you will be asked all kinds of questions and maybe you will be detained or you will be refused. So there will be always something like that. Within European Union, I think the challenge will be again, like Italy has said, that even if you have vaccinated yourself, you can't come to Italy when the lockdown is there. So how this exceptional time will be negotiated and the border which is actually serving both an exceptional time as well as a routine time how that will be managed will be rather the more, significant question.
Okay, there are two questions on Rohingyas. I'm going to club them and then I'll come to Francis's question. Do you see the relocation of the Rohingya to the Bhashan Char as a crucial logistic aspect of governance? And do you see it as an externalization of border control? If yes, how will, wait 1 second. Yeah. If yes, how do you feel it will reshape, affect their identity, as keeping in mind the stateless question in mind? Yeah. And the second one, Ranavisa, on the Rohingyas. 1 second. Yeah. How do you relate border and within, in a parenthesis, mobility and acculturation of refugees, especially Rohingyas, in the pandemic time India? So I guess there's a two question, one on Bangladesh and one on India. So yeah.
I mean, relocation of Rohingyas to
Bhashan Char.
Bhashan Char is, I think, certainly a crucial aspect of governance of refugees and migrants. And it is certainly a logistical aspect. I mean, if you think of that, this is what was called the Pacific solution, where you do not allow the asylum seekers to enter the quote and unquote the mainland. So the Pacific solution, as you know, which Australia did, was simply then confine the boat people to offshore islands and offshore places, and then building up places of stay there with, indifferent infrastructure of livelihood. So this may happen to Bhashan Char finally. This may, 100 years later, will become perhaps an Andaman. We don't know. Because, as I said, that many of the islands from the 16th or 17th century onwards, they have the same histories. They began as penitentiaries, they began as places of detention, etc., etc. So it may happen. And whether it is an externalization of border control, yes, it is. But then there will also be the challenge how to control them so that they don't escape from there. But I think for me the more interesting question is that how do you accommodate the stateless within the state? Because the first part of the question is, the answer is on the whole obvious. But the second part of the question is more interesting because the stateless is supposedly without an identity. Stateless cannot be an identity. Stateless means the stateless has no identity. So the person has identity of having no identity. So you can see that it is one of the extreme cases of what you call paradox. Now, how do you therefore give an identity to a group of people whom you cannot give an identity? Simply by putting them in a place and say they are the residents of Bhashan Char and they were Rohingyas. And therefore gradually you may say that they will become they will acquire the identity of being the residents of Bhashan Char. And now what kind of future identity this will lead to, political identity or etc., we cannot tell now. But it is, again, I shall say that it is important to read the histories of the 17th, 18th, and early 19th century. There is again, I mean, it certainly comes to my mind, this research of, I think, forgetting 3 or 4 volumes of Indian overseas expeditions into the Southeast and probably Far East of Indian Army up to 1840s. There are other, again, very interesting histories of these penal colonies, how they grew up, and finally, what kind of political identities the people of those islands took. The difference is that in those days they were only punished, but they did not have the identity of a stateless, so the identity of having no identity. But now you have this major paradox in terms of liberal politics, in terms of liberal theory of rights, in terms of liberal theory of identity, that you want to give an identity of whom to whom you have said have no identity. And I think that is one of the biggest question marks facing the global declarations, etc., etc. And what was the second thing, Nasreen?
Second, on the Rohingya.
I think I have,
Yeah, I think you've covered it. Yeah.
Yes.
This is more the question of Rohingyas in India, basically. How do you relate border mobility and acculturation of refugees, especially Rohingyas in pandemic time in India? So they're two different, one talking about Bangladesh, the relocation aspect, the other one, I guess, their situation in India.
All I can say is that the pandemic led to the invocation of the National Disaster Management Act and the Plague Act, the Epidemic Diseases Control Act. These gave enormous powers to the central government. And therefore, it also allowed the central government to reshape federal practices. And part of this was felt necessary by all, or other political forces fell in line because they thought this was the route, or simply they had no other option. But more important, that this created an atmosphere where you find more assertive moves by the government to deport the Rohingyas. But it has led to many other things. So centralization of powers, centralization of authority, in some senses, more or stricter enforcement of regulations. All these are products of the pandemic time. But the but is that you must see the other side, which is that because of the pandemic, the states realize that finally they are left to themselves in most of the time. They have to somehow or other manage the situation. They have to build the infrastructure of public health management. They have to manage the migrants who will come back. They have to feed millions of mouths. And it is remarkable of the country, not only of West Bengal, that by and large, hunger deaths were avoided given the enormity of the situation. So states too have acquired a kind of confidence that yes, the pandemic also, we have shown that we can manage. So we are there too. Don't dismiss us. So it actually, if you ask me, the tussle between the center and the state, or the contentious nature of Indian federalism, moves on to a newer stage in the wake of the pandemic. So to say that Indian federalism was diluted, or federalism is kind of rather the way power is distributed along constitutional lines and the governance framework lines, they are redistributed. But to say that it is only a one-way distribution that is happening would be too hasty a judgment.
I guess, Ranavida, that takes care of Francis's question. I'm sorry,
Yes.
I apologize. Yeah, because I think you have kind of touched upon this whole idea of post-federalism, move away from cooperative federalism to the current dispensation, given the fact, certain things that he's attributing. So would you like to say a word or two more to it? Or I think you've covered it fairly.
I said that federalism is, in a way, it's a constitutional word, and it only covers your insights into how politics works. It helps you to understand in terms of a legal framework, but to the extent it helps you to understand, fair enough, but we have to go deeper into the way in which power is distributed in the country among the constituent units. And so power is that famous line, power is a two-way. Power is not only flowing from one point of origin, to a one point of receiving. That's not. It's a flow.
So I'm afraid we've come to the end of it. I really apologize if I haven't been able to cover all your questions in detail. We were trying to
1 minute,
have it.
Nasreen, can you just give me 1 minute? Just
Sure.
Nasreen, I think there's one more question in the Q&A box about the CAA and the NRC.
Okay.
yes, sorry.
Okay, Ranavida, there is one more question.
One more question.
Yes, please. I'm sorry. I was trying to wrap it up, but then Shamata kind of suggested that I overlooked. Again, I'm not very good at this. I'm sorry. I was trying to club all the questions together so that it would give an effective, conversation mode. So there's a question by Amol Sharkar. Can you please give some light on likely impact of CA and RC on this issue?
On which issue? Mobility.
I'm reading. Yes.
Mobility or no? Or,
I guess what he's saying is, what would be the impact, or the question of how would CA and NRC be impacted upon in your discussion? Would there be, any kind of, can you factor in those aspects while in your discussion of borders and mobility?
I think we have already, I have already provided part of the answer. That borders produce the most important identity of our time, which is citizenship. While other identities are there, they are important, but the most important identity is the citizen. And then mobility complicates the whole question. So who is a citizen? And therefore, the whole idea of jus soli, jus sanguinis, will you be a citizen if you have come from elsewhere? What is the proof that you have? All those things, identities. So all these are involved in that. We can only say that the threat of border, the threat of deportation, the threat of confining you, the threat of expulsion, as I, refer to Saskia Sassen's great work, expulsions, which speaks of, some of the experiences of late 19th century repeating today, they come back. And they show, therefore, that the fit between border, citizenship, nation, all these things, it's a story of the past. That fit between, these elements do not anymore sit comfortably with each other. And the template of nation state is therefore a very problematic template. On the other hand, states try to also acquire the imperial form, get certain characteristics of the imperial form where they can have graded territoriality. How do they manage both? They try to manage both, but it only keeps on complicating the entire scenario. Khola, khola.
So thank you so much, Ranavita. The official vote of thanks will be given by Rajat, but I think all of you will agree, those who have sat through the discussion and the very enlightening talk, that we have much to think about and ponder about. So thank you so much, Professor Shamatdar, and over to you, Rajat.
Thank you, ma'am. It's my pleasure to convey my gratitude to all the audience in this public lecture. On behalf of this institution, I am thankful to Professor Ranavi Shamatdar for his fascinating presentation. This lecture enlightened several aspects in the field of migration and border studies. We are also thankful to Dr. Nasreen Chowdhury for moderating the discussion. My colleague Priyankar De helped us by designing the poster. He deserves a separate mention for this thoughtful work. I am also thankful to members of the webinar committee, my colleagues, and my colleagues at the office and the honorary director of CRG for their advice and help. Last but not the least, I would like to convey our thanks to our funders, Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung and Institute for Human Sciences Vienna, for their continuing support towards our research in migration and post-migration studies. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Roger. Thank you.